They said my signs were a violation, fined me, threatened legal action, even warned of property liens. But what they didn't know was that I had uncovered a Supreme Court decision that would shatter their entire argument. And when I revealed it, the room went completely still. When I first moved into this neighborhood, it felt like a peaceful escape. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that claimed to protect community standards. I followed every rule, even the ones that seemed more about power than purpose. I kept my head down, paid the dues, and never stirred trouble. But everything shifted the moment I placed 3 modest election signs on my front lawn. Overnight, the HOA descended like vultures. Letters citing obscure violations, escalating fines, and veiled threats of legal action. It was never really about the signs. It was about control, about silencing anyone who didn't fall in line. But what they didn't count on was this. I'd been quietly doing my homework. I uncovered a Supreme Court case that struck at the heart of their so-called authority. They thought I was just another compliant neighbor. What they didn't realize was that I was about to put their entire power trip on trial. It started with a letter, just a plain, white envelope slipped under my door like an afterthought. Inside was a printed notice. Remove unauthorized signage. Violation of HOA Regulation 4.2.3. No signature, no explanation, just a warning. At first, I didn't take it too seriously. It was election season. People had signs. Mine were small, one about a local council candidate, another promoting a ballot measure, and one that simply said, "Your voice matters." They weren't vulgar, political in any extreme sense, or out of place. But a few days later, another letter arrived, this time with a fine, $50. The next day, $150. By the end of the week, the fine had reached $500. It wasn't about the signs anymore. It was about me. That's when Karen showed up. She didn't knock. She didn't call ahead. She just stood on my front porch with her HOA badge clipped to a windbreaker like she was some kind of authority figure. "Just doing my job," she said, glancing at the signs like they were toxic waste. "It's not personal. It's policy." Then as she turned to leave, she pointed out that my grass was exactly 0.7 inches too long, according to regulation standards. She smiled when she said it. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't about community pride. This was personal. Within days, it escalated. I began noticing people in unmarked cars slowing down in front of my house, then stopping, then taking photos. One morning, I looked out my window and saw someone crouched by my mailbox with a tape measure. I opened the door. They scattered. The next HOA notice cited my mailbox as being non-compliant in both height and color tone. I tried talking to my neighbors, people I'd waved to for years. They looked away, avoided eye contact. Some stopped responding to texts. One friend finally admitted quietly that the HOA had encouraged residents to file anonymous reports if they noticed any violations on my property. Suddenly, I was public enemy number 1. Then came the arbitration notice. The HOA wanted to resolve the matter privately, but I wasn't allowed to bring legal representation. Just me, sitting across from their panel, expected to explain why I thought my constitutional rights applied within a community governed by HOA bylaws. That was the last straw. What they didn't know, what none of them had any idea about, was that I had already started digging. It began as curiosity. I wondered, could they really do this? Could a group of neighborhood volunteers just override my rights because they didn't like my signs? Turns out the answer wasn't buried in some obscure code. It was right at the top, the Constitution. More specifically, a 2015 Supreme Court case, Reed versus Town of Gilbert. I read every word. Then I read it again. The court had ruled that municipalities, governments, could not impose restrictions on signs based on their content without violating the First Amendment. And while HOAs weren't governments in the strictest sense, courts across the country had started citing this precedent when homeowner associations overstepped, especially when they claimed policy as a weapon against personal expression. I began documenting everything, every fine, every photo, every vague complaint. I printed out legal precedents, highlighted inconsistencies in the HOA's own regulations, and cross-referenced them with local ordinances. I even discovered that Karen herself had once displayed signs on her lawn. No fines, no letters. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. It was systemic. But I kept quiet. I didn't fight back. Yet. I wanted them to think they'd won. That I was folding under pressure. That I'd given up. Behind the scenes, I was building a case so solid it would make even the most smug HOA president sweat. They thought they had me cornered. That I'd cave, pay the fines, take down the signs, and disappear. But the truth, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. And Judgment Day was coming. For weeks, they pushed me further, escalating threats, doubling fines, turning my neighbors against me, and trying to grind me into submission through sheer attrition. What they didn't know was that with every notice they left on my door, I was digging deeper. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was researching. I combed through case law, searched HOA precedents, and cross-checked constitutional protections against local regulations. At night, my dining table became a war room, covered in folders, highlighted court cases, and sticky notes that mapped every move the HOA had made. And then I found it. Buried in a collection of municipal code disputes and obscure court battles, one name kept resurfacing. Reed Veer's Town of Gilbert, 2015. I clicked it open, and within minutes, I knew I was staring at the game changer. The Supreme Court had ruled in no uncertain terms that sign regulations based on content were a violation of the First Amendment. It didn't matter if the signs were political, religious, or personal. If you tried to regulate what someone could say based on what they were saying, you were breaking the law. It was a moment of eerie stillness, the kind you feel before a storm hits. But this time, I was the one bringing it. I printed the entire opinion, 60-some pages. I read every one, annotated the critical sections, and prepared a set of documents for each HOA board member. I made sure the language was highlighted, bolded, and impossible to ignore. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, I wasn't just walking in as a homeowner. I was walking in as a constitutional sledgehammer. The meeting was in the community clubhouse. Dim lighting, folding chairs, a weak pot of coffee steaming in the corner. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, flipping through papers like she had better things to do. I walked in holding a neatly organized stack of binders, one for each board member. Without a word, I placed them in front of everyone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Karen looked up, smirking. "Is this your appeal?" "No," I said. "It's your reckoning." A few raised eyebrows. One guy on the board, Tim, I think, flipped his open and started reading. His face shifted almost instantly. "This is from the Supreme Court?" he asked, glancing at Karen, confused. "Reed Veer's Town of Gilbert," I said calmly. 2015. The court ruled that sign restrictions based on content violate the First Amendment, meaning your fines, your threats, and your so-called policies aren't just wrong, they're unconstitutional. Karen's smile froze. "This only applies to cities and towns," she said, her voice tight. "We're not a government body." "True," I replied, "but multiple courts have already ruled that when an HOA tries to act like one, by suppressing speech, issuing penalties, and enforcing public-facing restrictions, they're subject to the same constitutional standards, especially when there's a pattern of selective enforcement." I reached into my folder and pulled out a color photo. Karen's lawn from the previous year, covered in signs supporting her favorite candidates. "Funny," I said. "I don't remember seeing any violation letters then." The room was silent, dead silent. Karen's face had gone pale. Tim was still reading, eyes wide. Another board member, an older woman who'd mostly stayed quiet during previous meetings, finally spoke. "We could get sued for this," she said under her breath. I didn't need to say anything else. The weight of the truth had already shifted the room. I could feel it. I had walked in alone, but I wasn't outnumbered. Not anymore. I had the law on my side. I had proof. I had precedent. Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. She muttered something about needing legal review and walked out, her composure cracking with every step. She never looked back. I sat there for another 5 minutes, letting the board read, letting the truth settle in, letting them realize exactly how far they'd pushed this and exactly how wrong they had been. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't need to, because the Supreme Court had already done the talking for me, and in that moment, they knew it was real. The fallout didn't take long. Word spreads fast in a neighborhood like mine, especially when the mighty HOA suddenly finds itself on the wrong side of the law. By the following morning, homeowners who had once stayed quiet were stepping onto their lawns with signs in hand. Not just political ones either. Messages of unity, free speech, even one that just said, "Nice try, Karen." It was as if a silent chain had been snapped. Neighbors who'd previously whispered behind closed doors now spoke freely. Someone created a group chat titled HOA Watchdogs, and it exploded with screenshots, scanned letters, and personal stories, some even worse than mine. One family had been fined for placing a small "Support Our Troops" sign in their flower bed. Another was harassed over a Happy Diwali banner. Turns out I wasn't the first target, just the one who finally fought back. And then the petition dropped. It started with a single paragraph calling for the HOA to suspend all enforcement of sign restrictions and immediately review their bylaws in light of the Supreme Court ruling. By that evening, it had more than 100 signatures. A community once cowed into silence was now demanding accountability, and they were naming names. Karen was at the top of the list. I had heard she tried to hold an emergency board meeting the next day, but attendance was thin and her usual grip over the room was gone. People had read the ruling. They'd read the binders I'd handed out. Some had even looked up interviews with the plaintiffs from the Reed case, seeing for themselves that the issue wasn't just legal, it was moral, fundamental. That's when the media caught wind. A local reporter showed up on my doorstep with a camera crew, holding a printed copy of the petition and asking for an interview. I wasn't interested in making it about me, but I agreed, because I knew someone had to. That night the headline aired, HOA tries to ban political signs, gets slammed by Supreme Court ruling. The clip went viral across the county. HOA boards in nearby communities started quietly updating their rules, trying to get ahead of any fallout. Lawyers weighed in on local radio stations, citing the Reed decision and affirming everything I'd said at that board meeting. The public tide had turned, and Karen, she was sinking fast. I later found out she tried to double down, circulating an internal memo claiming I had misrepresented the legal facts and urging the board to stand firm. But her own legal counsel shut it down. Hard. "If you pursue this," the email reportedly said, "you're going to lose. Badly. And the liability will fall on those who ignored legal precedent." That was the nail in the coffin. By the next HOA meeting, the boardroom was packed, not with silent, nodding members like before, but with residents, real people who had lived under their thumb for years. Karen sat at the head of the table, but her voice had no weight left. One by one, residents stood up and spoke, calmly, clearly, without fear. By vote, every fine issued to me was formally rescinded, and not just mine. The board agreed to review every violation related to signage from the past 5 years. Refunds were issued, apologies were sent, though in most cases, far too late to matter. And Karen, she resigned. No dramatic speech, no farewell email, just a notice posted on the HOA website. Effective immediately, Karen Mitchell will be stepping down as HOA president. That was it. Her reign undone not by protest or protesters, but by paper, by the law, by a Supreme Court ruling she had never bothered to read. The most satisfying part wasn't her resignation. It was what came after. The board, now led by someone with a spine and a conscience, publicly voted to rewrite the HOA's bylaws. They invited residents to help draft the new version. Transparency replaced secrecy. Bullying was replaced with collaboration. And for the first time, people actually wanted to attend the meetings. Me? I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. The neighborhood had found its voice. But if you ever walk by my house now, you'll still see one of the signs I first put up. It's weathered, a little faded, but I keep it planted in the ground. Not because I need to make a statement, but because I can. Because the right to express yourself, to speak freely, is worth defending, even on a front lawn, especially on a front lawn. And just like that, the HOA learned a hard lesson. You can bully a neighbor, but you can't bully the Constitution. They tried to silence one voice and instead awakened an entire neighborhood. But victory doesn't always come with clean endings. 3 days after Karen resigned, I found something in my mailbox. No return address, no signature, just a folded piece of paper with 2 words typed in all caps. We remember. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. A quiet reminder that some people don't forget being challenged, especially when they're used to controlling the room. So no, this might not be over, but I'm not afraid. I stood my ground once, and I'll do it again if I have to. Now it's your turn. What would you do if your HOA came after you? Drop your wildest story in the comments. I want to hear it. Like and subscribe if you believe in standing up for your rights. And if you thought this was wild, wait until you hear what another HOA did over Christmas lights. You won't believe it.